Welcome to the Regroup Hour, the podcast that's all about how we make and manage change by building a bedrock of self-care. Self-care that comes from self-awareness and self-compassion. This is a gentle hour-ish to take some time out for yourself, to simply be and see whatever this time brings. It truly is an opportunity to regroup.
Hi, welcome back. This episode of the podcast is actually inspired by a conversation that I had with my own coach quite recently, and it prompted me to reflect on what are my non-negotiables. What are the things that I see as being absolutely fundamental to how I work, how I rest, how I play? What are the things that define the way that I want to be in the life that I am creating around me right now? So one of the things that prompted this conversation or prompted this reflection is looking back across my own story, across the pattern that I have personally of overdoing things. It's one of the reasons why I believe so passionately in this practice of self-care, and why I have such a kind of ingrained, strong sense of why it's so important that we care for ourselves, because I've seen in myself, as well as in so many of the clients that I work with, what can happen when we don't practice that self-care, and how when we don't pay attention to our own well-being, always deprioritizing our own needs, or thinking that we'll sort that out tomorrow, and then tomorrow never comes, or perhaps ignoring health issues, psychological or physical. You know, how all of this sort of stuff, these habits that can actually inhibit us from caring for ourselves, how they can be really detrimental to us. So it sparked this thinking around, okay, so what are my non-negotiables? What are the things that I sense now are really, really sort of set, not in a rigid, brittle way, but really are strong foundations of how I am and how I choose to be. So my non-negotiables, I think, looking back, I mean, this is a very sort of top of mind reflection, but just often that's useful, because it gives us a bit of insight to what our intuitive, instinctive voice is saying. So when I thought about what my non-negotiables used to be, I came up with work incredibly hard, be present for others, certainly within a work context, but also, I hope, I see within a family and a friendship context. But I also recognise that work has always been quite a dominant factor, whether that was schoolwork or employed work. Give endlessly of myself is another one that I wrote down. So I think kind of giving to the point of draining. And always being the one who can keep going, that kind of badge of honor of I can do that. I can do that extra bit. So keeping going and keeping going and keeping going until ultimately, my body on a number of occasions just said no and stopped me in my tracks, and actually led to ill health being the sort of catalyst to resting. So when I think about what are my new non-negotiables, I can see how those other ones, those old stories, how they've actually helped me identify what's really important to me now. So things like in the past where the goal was always get the work done and then think about other things. Now it feels much more important to me to make sure that I get outside at least once a day. I mean, I sometimes don't do it, I have to say, but that I get outside for some good immersion at least a few times every week. That's really what the non-negotiable is. That I spend time with my family, with my immediate family. That I have time for myself is absolutely non-negotiable. That has really been the biggest shift for me. And that I focus on my well-being. And that's all tied up with those other things. So I think there's something else here as well as you're listening to this, is that sometimes some of those things may have felt like nice to haves. So getting outside into nature in the past would have felt like a nice to have. But as I've grown in awareness of what actually serves me and what I need personally, so this isn't something that applies to everybody, although maybe some of it, applies to a lot of us. Getting out into nature stops being a nice to have and it becomes, an absolute fundamental need. So I think, one of the threads that comes through here is how these things that we see as being non-negotiable, how they actually change over time and they mature with us. So they change according to our life circumstance and they become clearer to us as we become clearer about what's really important to us. And one of the things I'm going to talk about shortly is about how they connect to values and purpose. So an example here about how things become clearer as we become more self-aware is with my husband Anton. And I think I've talked in the past on the podcast about he has a really deep need to get out on his bicycle. He's always been a cyclist, I think. I mean, even when we were at university together, he and one of our flatmates cycled to the south of France together. So it's always been something that he has loved. But now he recognises that it's actually a form of therapy for him. And he'll actually say, I'm off to see my therapist, when he's talking about going off on a big bike ride, because he's seen that the benefits of it massively outweigh the impact of the time that it takes and the effort that it takes. So it's always worth going. It's always worth that investment in his time, in his energy output, because the benefits that he receives from it are so huge that it becomes a non-negotiable. It becomes something that he knows he has to create the space in his life in order that he is able to go and do these big bike rides. And so that's also important in terms of our relationship as well, that I recognise that. I understand how important it is for him and that I create the space too. Because as we know, when our lives are entwined with other people's, it can become very easy for us to start to influence the way that they spend their time. And we need to be mindful that we're really listening to what their needs are and not just imposing our own desires and wants upon them. So clearly these non-negotiables, these things that really are the foundations for our well-being, they're different for each of us, and that's absolutely okay. For me, the idea of going for a bike ride is kind of nice, but it's not. It doesn't hold the same meaning that it holds for Anton. And they'll also really strongly depend on whether you're an introvert, whether you're an extrovert and maybe you really, one of your non-negotiables is actually that you have to have that direct contact with other human beings. Or maybe you're a highly sensitive person, or HSP, as we say, and perhaps there's something there around really needing to make sure that you maintain your own space in order to kind of declutter from the impact that spending time with other people can add to your life. And these things as well, they'll also really strongly depend upon our life stage as well. So certainly, in my 20s, the things that felt important to me as being really fundamental to me are very different from how they are now. And actually, I would have said, I think when I was younger, that spending time with other people was absolutely vital to my well-being. I really sort of hated it. If there were a group of people around at our house when we were students, even if I was really tired, I'd hate going off to bed because I just loved that thing about being surrounded by people. And I'd almost invariably end up falling asleep on the sofa with the noise of their chatter around me because that fueled me. Whereas now, I really, really need my personal space. I really need time on my own. I need that time for reflection. So these things change. And as you're listening to me, I wonder whether there are things coming up for you that you think, oh, actually, yeah, that has shifted for me, and this feels far more important for me. And as you notice those thoughts, perhaps also just reflect on, are they being satisfied? Are those needs, those non-negotiables, are they really being met right now? And from here as well, we can start to consider, well, what do they tell you about your values and your sense of purpose, your sense of, how you derive meaning from life, from the life that you are creating for yourself. So values tend not to change over time. It's one of the things that they tend to be very deeply embedded. They come from nature and nurture, but they're often very, very profound experiences for us. So I think sometimes we can see that these things that are non-negotiable can be connected in with our values as well. Perhaps one of those things is respecting other people's right to their own opinion. And that is one of my non-negotiables, that I have a right to my own thoughts, to my own feelings, and my own sense of the world, and that feels absolutely non-negotiable to me. But equally, I respect that of others too. That's one of the reasons why I love the work I do, I suppose. But there's something here about values as well, that when we act out of alignment with them, so maybe there is something happening in our life, something which may ordinarily be a non-negotiable concept because it's so tightly aligned with our values. Maybe that's being disrupted in some way, or maybe it's not being met. So, for example, even if someone's value is loyalty, but they've been so hurt in the past that they've actually learned not to trust people, and therefore loyalty isn't being met because they're not able to trust others enough to be loyal to them. That can lead to really deep discomfort because that value isn't being honoured. And so there's also something here, if you kind of have a sense that something something that's really, really important to you isn't being allowed expression, then maybe there's an opportunity to bring a little bit of attention to it and just see what isn't being met right now. And maybe where there's an opportunity here to perhaps reframe something for yourself. Or even to see where perhaps something you consider to be important for you may actually be holding you back in some way. So again, just taking a bit of time to, to connect with what's going on for yourself, and the things, perhaps the ways of working, ways of prioritizing, the different aspects of, of all the different components you've got in your life. Maybe just having a look at that and just see, are your needs being fully met? Are your values being honoured? And therefore, are the things where you're really committing to be non-negotiable for you, are they serving you fully? So there's a further sort of aspect to this as well, which is choosing how to frame something as a non-negotiable can also potentially be really useful when we're coming into making behavioural changes. So an example for me is when I stopped smoking. And again, I've talked about this in the past. I can't quite believe I ever smoked. It's just astonishing to me, but I did. So when I stopped smoking, when I changed my nutrition, when I changed the way that I thought about food, that I was able, because of the support that I received, I was able to take the struggle out of those choices. And that's something that making something non-negotiable helps us take the struggle out of it. We stop wrestling with ourselves. We stop using that language of I'm going to try and do something, and we start using the language of I do or I don't do. So I don't smoke, I eat well, rather than I try to eat well or I'm trying to stop smoking, neither of which are sort of very strong statements of intent. So if it's a non-negotiable, it's just I don't smoke, I look after myself, I take care of my body, I rest, I care about myself. These can become our new non-negotiables, rather than I always get the job done, I'm never late, I can always be relied on to be the last person in the office. And I hope you can sort of start to see where some of these non-negotiables are still very, they're very powerful messages of intent, essentially. So the other sort of factor here as well is something I've talked about quite a bit on the podcast, is how family or inherited stories can also influence these choices that we make, these ways of putting a stake in the ground and saying, well, this is something that I stand by, this is something which is important to me. Because we can actually come up against resistance from others. Perhaps they don't get your innate awareness of what your non-negotiables need to be, or maybe they don't like them. And therefore, sometimes that influence from other people can also help us start to think that what we're feeling isn't valid or is in some way untrue. So paying really deep attention to the way that others may be influencing us, if that feels as though you're in an environment where perhaps there's a little bit of control or a lot of control going on around you. Really just taking a bit of a breath and noticing that, and then seeing, okay, well, how is that impacting me? And how is that impacting the way that I care for myself? And obviously, all of this, this whole idea of self-care, this is not narcissism. This is not self at all costs. This is learning how to bring that really compassionate and grounded and strong stance of self-care in order that we are able to have an open mind and an open heart in the way that we relate to others too. Because until we establish that for ourselves, it's really hard to establish it fully with others, and we can just end up getting drained. This is really directly connected with the first episode of this season as well, season 3. So the first episode of season 3, where I talk about the different things that we need to invest in order to make changes in our lives. And one of those things is our energy. So the willingness to invest our energy in ourselves actually refuels us in order that we are better able to then invest energy in others, rather than ending up and being drained. So I think the sort of last kind of key point here really is around boundaries. I mentioned that briefly earlier. This idea of how can you help others understand why these are so important to you, why these perhaps they're self-care practices. So for me, it's meditation, it's journaling, it's my gratitude practice, it's time on my own, it's getting out for a walk at least, a few times every week, it's having a hot bath every now and again, and just really, really enjoying that sort of practice, all of those practices of nurturing and nourishing myself. It's been absolutely essential for me to be able to talk to my husband, to Anton, about that, and and for him to understand that me being able to do this makes me a much happier and more contented woman, and therefore much nicer to be around, quite honestly. So what are these things that really, really serve you, these deep practices that are non-negotiable, that really serve you? How do they show up in the way that you work? So another one for me is I've been really reflecting on how I manage my diary. I work for myself, so I've got more flexibility, and I'm very grateful for that. But it's very easy, actually, when you work for yourself to get caught in that cycle of working all the time and never switching off. So how do I make sure that I build those into my working practices as well? And I'm doing some really great, very specific, very practical things there that become and are non-negotiable for me. Unless something happens and I make a very strong value judgment around, no, actually, I can make a shift there. The challenge is that if we keep shifting, the thing stops being non-negotiable. So as with everything, there's always a balance. So just thinking about what are your practices, what are your behaviours that really feel like they're the foundations to your well-being. And then is there anyone that you need to ensure understands that, either overtly or perhaps a bit more subtly? So where are the boundaries, where are the conversations that you would benefit from having in order that you are fully able to honour these needs? So That was a bit of a canter, I think. I'm sitting in my little cupboard and I have no means of knowing how long I've been talking to you. So this could have been 10 minutes or it could have been half an hour or longer. I have no idea. Let's see. When I exit my little cupboard, I'll actually take a photograph of me in here so you can see what it's like. It's terribly glamorous. And as ever, thank you so much for listening. I really hope this finds you safe. I hope it finds you well. I hope it finds you happy. Thank you to the wonderful Angus from Chango Music for his music and his production and his wise counsel. And I send you a hug and a wave.